Right, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming again. And for those online, thank you for joining us. Stuart probably needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. He's been the director of the Museum of Bath at Work for 30
years.
Yes, over 30 years.
Yes.
And his background's in social history, and he's just a total encyclopedia of all sorts of facts about social history in general and Bath in particular. And we always like having him here because you never quite know what he's going to say. So, Stuart, I'll pass over to you, and I'm sure you'll surprise us.
Well, I don't know about surprise, but thank you for. Do you normally have the lights off? Yeah.
Lights off, or would you rather have them on?
No, off. I'd rather not see that. First of all, thank you to the institution for asking me to come. I'm glad you're all able to make it. As advertised, I'm the director of the Museum of Bath at Work, and museums like the one where I've worked for all this time traditionally celebrated industrialization, celebrated the products, the mechanization of manufacturing, urbanization, all of those things. And I'm sure you've visited industrial museums. Very few industrial museums call themselves industrial museums anymore. But one of the things that we're all in the business of doing these days is looking at the reckoning of this period, the Industrial Revolution, whatever that was. People still, pondering about it, but certainly looking at the results, the effects of all of that, process that we've gone through over the last 200, 300 years or so. And in a short while, the museum's going to open an exhibition called Costing the Earth, which is about how that process affects Bath over the period since about 1700. And in a lot of ways, the experience of Bath is typical. It's not unlike all other towns, and in some ways it has some peculiarities, which I'm going to talk about. But what I wanted to talk about this evening was an aspect of the effects of that period of urbanization, industrialization, pollution of the environment in regard to transport, and in particular in regard to traffic, motor traffic, which is a kind of function of urbanization, the growth of population, the growth of settlements, growth of transport. Between them, these are the Penguin covers of plays written by a post-war dramatist, Nigel Neal, who wrote sort of science fiction. These stories were dramatized on the BBC. In 1963, right about the time I was born, actually, I was talking to my mum about it, who saw it. Nigel Neal wrote a story called The Road, and The Road is a play set in the mid-18th century in a rural district where a clergyman and an aristocrat who's a kind of gentleman scientist, a natural philosopher, you would call them, are surprised when some country bumpkins come into the church to say they've heard strange sounds in the countryside. A noise, sounds of shouting, lots of noises that they can't understand, and say it's ghosts, it's some kind of haunting. So the natural philosopher and church clergyman go out to the countryside, hear these sounds. This is the age of reason, of course. They're trying to rationalize what it is. And only at the very end of the play does the viewer hear the sounds of the haunting. And in fact, what they're hearing is, rather than a ghost or haunting from the past, they're hearing a haunting from the future, because what they can hear is the sounds of cars on a motorway and people shouting because there's been an accident. And so what they're hearing is, in fact, something from the 20th century, which is coming back into the 18th. And at the end of the play, the natural philosopher says, one day men will come here and build a great road. And not only a road, the whole of the countryside that they're talking about has been built over, because this 4-lane motorway, which you hear the people talking about at the end of the play, the sounds that have come back with centuries, they're talking about living in a part of the country which has been completely built over. And, you know, it's an interesting play for all sorts of reasons, not least because, you know, one of those preoccupations in the 1960s was traffic, was the impact of the motor car, you know, this very symbol of advanced technology in the 1960s, at least the internal combustion engine, and how it was going to affect, you know, the way we live. There's a part of the story which I haven't told you because you may well see it or read it, but there's a twist is the reason why the haunting has come back into the 18th century. But we know all too well, living in Bath, about traffic. And, you know, there are a number of things to consider about that that have always been the case. The first is Bath has always been on a main road. It's always been on the A4 between London and the southwest. So it's always been a place where traffic has passed straight through it. There's local traffic, you know, you and me driving to and from the outskirts or nearby settlements. And then there's the tourist train. So there's always been these 3 elements of traffic which are sort of compound the problem of a traditional street plan. You know, one of the things I think, you know, is a bit of a paradox. People come to Bath, complain about the road system and parking and that kind of thing, but at the same time, what they've come to see is an historic environment. So, you know, you can't have it both ways. You can't have, you know, easy access, easy traffic without, you know, this kind of thing. And the pollution that we're talking about, and I think it, you know, people tend to think about motor traffic purely in the meaning of atmospheric pollution, you know, the pollution from the exhaust. We're talking about noise pollution, talking about the sound of the motor vehicle. I think this is less, you know, it's less of an issue when we get to electric cars, but I think as this is an historical review, talking about the internal combustion engine, and there's the noise of motor vehicles, there's the sound, there's the light pollution. You know, we talk about pollution as being something that you can smell or hear. There's also the fact it's affecting our appreciation of our surroundings. You know, as cities have developed, and street lights, car lights, that kind of thing, there's the effect that traffic might have on our mental health, you know, on, you know, the pollution of our wellness, how we're feeling about things. So, I mean, this pollution issue is wider simply than atmospheric. And I think, you know, we think about it, particularly in Bath, not simply what we're breathing in, but what it does to the built environment. It's not simply, you know, the natural environment, built environment. And what I wanted to talk about, you know, 3 episodes, you might say, 3 incidents in the period since 1700, where the idea of having people reconcile the urbanization and everything that goes with it and the natural environment, you know, are addressed. How we might, you know, on one hand, live in an urbanized environment, but also appreciate the natural environment, which hopefully we're doing more and more these days. And part of the reason why that historically has been an issue is because one of the ways that the city has promoted itself is not simply as you know, a spa, the treatments and all those other activities, but also as, you know, a beautiful place in a natural setting. one of those things in the 19th century in particular. People talk about how beautiful place Bath is, nestled in this kind of valley, and how the architecture and the development has been somehow in keeping with that. So, the setting is an important one. So the first one I want to talk about is John Wood, the famous architect, John Wood the Elder, famous architect in connection with Bath. Interesting chap, quite apart from all his achievements, not least because, he held some rather unusual beliefs. I mean, not least that early 18th century Bath was in fact a mere fragment of a larger city, a triangular one side of which was 15 miles long and included the stone circles at Stanton Drew, which is, one of the things that he got wrong. But one of the things he did actually believe, and in a way, I mean, this is something which came back in the 1960s when architects started to feel like this, was what you might call, or what they called in the 1960s, architectural determinism. That is, that if you build a beautiful environment, it will actually affect how people think and act. It will affect their behaviors. And because John Wood thought that architecture was a God-given skill, that being an architect, well, like him, was heaven sent, actually producing these designs, these town planning schemes was something that was going to benefit us all because it was going to make us feel, have a higher level of appreciation and think about things more philosophically, simply because we're going to be surrounded by beautiful architecture. And this comes back in the great planning schemes in the 1960s. They were wrong about that as well, particularly university buildings, that if you marinade students in a modern architectural environment, it would turn them into better people. So this idea that 18th century Bath, if it could only be designed on this kind of grand plan, that people would appreciate the natural environment. They'd have a higher appreciation of the natural environment, and they'd actually be better people. And this comes back in the 1960s when we look, as we will in a moment, at things like traffic planning. But this kind of architecture was not simply beautiful. It had an effect on us, that it was actually going to be good for us. I mentioned about how the A4 passed through the centre of Bath. And, for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, well, that wasn't really too much of an issue, but it meant that through traffic coming through Bath would come along the London Road, come along the Paragon once it's been built, rather than Walcott Street, which is the traditional way into town. Come along the Paragon, along George Street, turn left into Gay Street, around Queen Square and onto the Upper Bristol Road. This here, probably recognise, is the junction of Gay Street and George Street, where the Oxfam shop is. By the early 1960s, this was regarded, and this is one of those fun facts you might want to remember, this was regarded as the worst turning on any A road in the United Kingdom. Because by the early 1960s, traffic coming from London to Bristol was having to negotiate this turn. And if you're even in a moderately sized car, negotiating this turn is quite something. But imagine an articulated lorry going around there, and there are some photographs, film made in the early 1960s of that very thing. It's amazing these corners, survived because it was a nightmare for it. And so by the early 1960s, as car ownership is starting to rocket, you know, this technology, the polluting technology, but you know, giving us this great freedom. You know, the road system, which had been designed, you know, some parts of it, you know, going back before the 18th century, but certainly an 18th century plan, and, you know, a need to preserve this kind of beautiful architectural heritage. You know, this is a pretty awful place to have to go across. Earlier than the 60s, just after the Second World War, you know, people had thought about the replanning of Bath. This is Patrick Abercrombie, a pioneer, street planner, town planner, really pioneer of the subject, and comes to Bath, engaged by the city council, who even in those days felt that the city, after the bombing of the Second World War, needed some kind of review. He too concerned about how the traffic might be kept away from everybody else. And I think one of those things that is a theme in the 20th century is how you could have civilized urban living in a place like Bath, surrounded by all this improving architecture, but at the same time have all those visitors coming, have the through traffic coming through the city, the local traffic from people like you and me. And that, you know, this sort of trying to reconcile these things is really where these town planners, the much maligned town planners and traffic planners, you know, have a go at reforming Bath. Abercrombie's the first. This here, one of his, looking at the problem of how to keep the through traffic out of the way, you know, how to stop it going along George Street and Gay Street. And he proposed, believe it or not, this is where Lansdowne Road meets Julian Road, because his plan was that traffic be diverted up Guinea Lane, which would turn into a you know, dual carriageway, if you can imagine it. It would go under the Lansdowne Road, which you can see it here, and then along the back of the Royal Crescent. So along the back of Victoria Park, and then join the Lower Bristol Road a bit further along. And you may well have seen this picture before. Along the way, the Royal Crescent was going to be converted into the council offices. So this is at the back of the Royal Crescent, and you can see the dual carriageway on the right-hand side, and the Royal Crescent kind of you know, nationalised, taken into local authority ownership. Unbelievable, really. Anyway, nothing comes of that. And this problem gets worse in the 1960s. You know, the traffic congestion is becoming you know, almost unbearable in places like Broad Street. You can see there. And the council engage the premier traffic planner, had worked at the Department of Transport, set up his own practice in 1963, Colin Buchanan, of Colin Buchanan Partners, there he is, and with the intention of commissioning him to devise some way in which all of those things about Bath could be reconciled, the pollution, the traffic, preserving the historic environment of the city, making it civilized for people to be surrounded by improving architecture. And, you know, you couldn't get a better definition of the motor car, really, could you? You know, we want to have our cake and eat it, don't we? We want to have the freedom of the motor car, but at the same time, we also want all those things that Bath delivers. And one of the things Buchanan pointed out right at the very beginning was that it wasn't simply the atmospheric pollution that was a problem. It was the visual pollution. It was the fact that having motor cars in the centre of cities, any city, but he called Bath in particular, he made a great play of the fact, our appreciation of the city was being compromised by the motor car, by its very presence. And because we couldn't see the wonderful architecture that the city was famous for. And I think it's one of those things, you go into the city now, we've just got used to it, haven't we? We've kind of been immunized to the effects of traffic on our appreciation of the city. But Buchanan was one of these people who thought, well, the only way you can have places like Bath retain their original appearance, retain that original feel, and not get, the atmospheric pollution effect of stone, was with something fairly radical. And radical he certainly was, because what he thought was that people and cars should be kept completely separate. That they shouldn't be, if you wanted cars, they had to be in a separate space. So really he's advocating that cities be pedestrianised. Cars, you don't restrict the cars, and I suppose this is one of those things in the 1960s, you just accommodate them, manage them, but you keep them separate. Now this here, believe it or not, is a plan, a sketch Buchanan and Partners had for Oxford Street in London. And the idea of the pedestrian decks, with all that rising pollution coming from the roads beneath. So the roads would be underneath and the people would be at this higher level. And so there'd be complete separation. This was the thing. So the visual pollution would be cut down, the noise pollution would be cut down. Ideally, if you kept them far enough away, the atmospheric pollution would be kept separate. And this was going to be the answer. Now, there'd be quite a few sacrifices along the way, as you can imagine. But this was laid out in his seminal book, Traffic in Town, at a time when, people was just starting to get to grips with it. And it's worth having just a quick look at what he had in mind for Bath, because this idea that somehow, and I think the City Council in 1964, when the plan was proposed, wanted what they called the historic core to be retained, that you keep traffic away from, the set pieces, the circus, the presence, the terraces, and that kind of thing. But somehow there'd be a whole lot of other parts of the city which would be sacrificed, what you might call collateral damage. Anyway, so one of the things that was actually carried into actuality was the Bath Eastern Bypass. That's something, is one of the only bits of the Buchanan plan of 1964 that was ever actually attempted. But where the road, you can see the A4 there, goes up on the to the left. In the original Buchanan plan, something much more radical was intended, and that was that this road would be extended and would come straight along through the back of Grosvenor, through Kensington Meadows. There you can see it. So it's sort of, you can see there in the middle of the picture on the left is the roundabout at the bottom of the A46, and then that extended, you can see it extends to the left, and at the very far bottom left you can see this new road splits in half. One half was called the Beckford Spur, and that connects with the A36 at Bathwick, and the other, if you can see, extending almost due west, extends along past Kensington, back of Kensington Meadows in the direction of Cleveland Bridge. So it would have come along here. This would have been where the dual carriageway would have run parallel to the old A4. This is Bathwick, so this is where there'd be this massive interchange. At the bottom is the link road, which would have connected this new dual carriageway with the A36. So it would have joined the A36 at near Sydney Gardens, and the road at the top carrying on, heading due west. There you can see it at the top right, going under Cleveland Bridge, at which point it comes into what is now Walcott Street. And the black lines are the new roads. And it would have basically resulted in Walcott Street being levelled. Not for, so a lot of rather characterful buildings would have been lost. But in the process, you'd build this new circulatory system, and you see the main road coming down from the top to the bottom. And there's a roundabout there you can see to the left of the centre, which is where this system, this new road, would have connected with the Paragon. The thing that people most remember, and the thing that I think the council wanted most of all, if you're going to keep the people and the cars separate, was a tunnel, the Buchanan Tunnel, which stretched from the top right at Walcott Street, just under Ladymead House. You know where that is? That's where the entrance of the Eastern Tunnel would have been. It would have gone under the circus, you can see there on the plan, and then it would have come out again, Crescent Gardens, in fact, just where the bowling green is, the tennis courts, that's where the Western Tunnel entrance would have been. And again, the road comes out. This is the entrance, another drawing of the entrance in Walcott Street. So it's a huge kind of scheme. This is a model of it. And you can see here at the bottom, on the bottom left is the river. And there the tunnel entrances underneath Ladymead and the Paragon at the top. And at the other end, at the Crescent Gardens end, well, that was going to be pretty dramatic as well. There was going to be this great big roundabout at the bottom of Charlotte Street. And then it was going to extend right the way around here to Green Park. So, lots of road building at either end, tunnel in the middle, with the intention of keeping all that through traffic out of the way. The other thing, clever, this really, was it's one thing to have the through traffic in the tunnel. The other was, what about all the local traffic? If you're going to pedestrianise the city centre, well, that was going to be underground. And this is a diagram that shows Walcott Street. And I suppose the bit to notice is at the left-hand end, because this is where the new road system was going to go underground and supply all the shops and businesses in the city centre through a network of caverns, like subsurface excavations, where you were going to supply shops and businesses with all the goods. There'd be underground car parks as well. And these white lines, it's not very easy to see, but these broad white lines where these underground passages were going to be. One of them was going to run under old New Bond Street. There it is, looking miserable and crowded and wet. And it was going to look like this. So there you have, this is the Buchanan decks, the pedestrians happily wandering around, looking through these apertures. It's not great to see, but there's a couple here in the middle of the picture, and they're looking down a rectangular aperture to the traffic beneath that's going and servicing the shops and the underground car parks, subsurface, whereas everybody else wanders around in the pedestrian environment. And you can see where that would have started, because they started it. Some building work was actually done because this, under the Hilton Hotel, was where this access was going to start. You'd come round Walcott Street, there'd be access beneath in the underground car park, which is beneath Waitrose. So that was actually going to be the start of it. They never got very much further. And you can see an example of what Buchanan might have had in mind at university, because there you have the very model of this, pedestrianised decks, road traffic below the surface, if you've been there. So this is what I think, a lot of the centre of Bath might have looked like, with the greatest of intentions. And I think, whatever you might think about this kind of urban desolation that this road building would have caused, which is really offset when they build the M4. Suddenly all this becomes completely obsolete once they start building motorways, because the through traffic issue was only one where they don't have motorways between London and Bristol. But this is this kind of utopian dream of a new improving architecture that would, the universities as this kind of a place where you make better people, because they were separated from all those noise and sound and light and pollution effects in the motor car. Ironically, it's students from Bath University and others who are the next bit of the story, the last part of the story, you might say, because if you're looking at people who trying to see how we might live a civilized life, well, in 1969, it's formed the Bath Arts Workshop, which on the face of it, if you ask people about the Bath Arts Workshop, what they say is, well, there's a lot of students dressing up, street theatre, this kind of thing, Walcott Streets, Fringe Festival, rock music, that kind of thing, street poetry, things. In fact, the Bath Arts Workshop is a pioneering organisation when it comes to being creating an environment to think about the environment. In 1969, whilst there's a lot of this carrying on, there's an important part of the organisation which is concerned with pollution and the environment and looking at it, because in 1962, when Rachel Carson brings out, the seminal book, The Silent Spring, about pesticides and pollution, in the wake of that, there's a great student movement looking at how to make sustainable technology, sustainable transport, and Bath Arts Workshop's one of those organisations. In fact, it's one of the pioneers of what will become the Centre for Alternative Technology at Machynlleth. I don't know if anyone has been there, but one element of the Bath Arts Workshop, which was called ComTech, which was is a reduction of the Community Technology Unit, is concerned with how we might have an alternative to motor transport, what it might do about traffic, how we might be more appreciative of the natural environment and the built heritage as well. I mean, that's another one of those dilemmas in Bath, natural heritage, the built heritage. This picture here is taken in 1970 when members of the Bath Arts Workshop with some students from Holland filled a motor car in the centre of the picture with concrete and left it in Southgate Street. There you can see. In fact, this is slightly later. This is in 1972. They did this several times. Filled a car with concrete as a protest against not one thing that was against was the Buchanan proposals, ironically, because I mean, what they thought about the Buchanan proposals was that it's just going to make more cars. You know, we're just pandering to increase ownership of motor cars. So this was a protest. They blocked the street with a car filled up with concrete, which is why it says road closed. So they were taking direct action against, the polluting effects of this technology. And in the early 1970s, the Comtech organization holds a whole series of festivals and seminars, international invitations. People like Buckminster Fuller came to Walcott Street. These sort of international figures coming to Bath to talk about sustainable technology, new technology, wind, solar, that kind of thing. And the Comtech 74 was one of the most famous. Interesting, as far as I'm concerned, at least. Neil Cozzens, or later Sir Neil Cozzens, who was keeper of technology at Bristol City Museum, was asked to speak at the Comtech 74. So someone who was at the forefront of the industrial heritage movement is asked to come and speak at a conference which is to do with sustainable technology. So these things are all kind of coming together. So wind turbines are one of the things, and in particular, making things from rubbish. Recycling, adaptive reuse. They were particularly interested in the reuse of car tires. So if you want to, looking at road transport and that kind of thing, the fact that they wanted to use what seems to be an unusable resource, and crushing motor cars using the steel and the metal content. Making structures from rubbish. Buckminster Fuller and his geodesic domes, very popular with the Bath Arts Workshop. In fact, you could make self-supporting structures like igloos out of anything, really. Didn't always stand up, but I mean, the theory of them at least. My brother's a structural engineer, and he's always trying to explain to me why it is that these appear to be the ideal solution, but in fact are structurally weak. But anyway, the fact you could throw something out made out of bits of scrap wood and cover it with plastic sheets, so this whole idea, and Bath really is at the forefront of this. We're not just a place where it's happening. Bath is one of the pioneers in developing this, holding these conferences, spreading the word about alternative transport. One of the things that's set up as part of the Arts Workshop was John's Bikes. For those of you who remember it, in Walcott Street, John Potter, the idea that you ride on bikes rather than motor vehicles, which in the late 1960s and 1970s was seen as a kind of old-fashioned approach to transport, is largely responsible for the London to Brighton cycle race, Potter, and the idea of buying a lot of old bikes and hiring them out. So this is a kind of an answer to the problems of transport. This here bizarre structure, part of the Comtech conference in 1975. I don't know if anyone's seen this picture before. It's what they call the solar trumpet, an attempt to show how you could get power from the sun. So it's a series of parabolic mirrors which are focused on, in the center of this structure, there's a container filled with water. And the heat is concentrated on the water, so it turns to steam. And then the horn, blasts, the steam comes out in a great sort of hooter. And the idea was quite what the people thought about it, living in Ringswell Gardens in the back of this picture, or Grosvenor, quite what they thought about it. And it was claimed by the people who built it, you could hear it 3 miles away. So as a demonstration of what the environment might do for you, solar power, at the beginning of using the sun for this kind of thing. You might be able to see there at the bottom left, it says solar station, that's what they called it. And I was talking to someone about they put it up, and he said, unfortunately, when the year it's set up, the weather was very poor. So in fact, there wasn't the solar trumpet didn't give many hoots because there wasn't that much sun. But one of those problems with this kind of technology, but impressive nonetheless. They only did it once. I imagine they had too many complaints when it did get to blast out. Perhaps the most famous aspects of this movement, or perhaps one of the most long-lasting, I mean, one would be the Bath Festival Fringe, the other is Walk at Reclamation. Walk at Reclamation was the first architectural salvage yard in Europe. So if you want an example of Bath being pioneering in this, the bike initiative, recycling, Walk at Reclamation as an architectural salvage yard, because there was as much of an interest in the architectural heritage as there was in the natural heritage. When in the early 1970s, protests against the Buchanan proposals were being, starting to accelerate, there was the interesting spectacle, and in fact, there's a piece of film to prove it, of students from the Bath Arts Workshop. I don't think they'd mind me if there were any ex-members, alumni of the Bath Arts Workshop here, as being long-haired next to members of the Bath Preservation Trust, marching side by side against the Buchanan proposals. So whilst, the Arts Workshop were interested in how the environment might be preserved, how we might look at it, how we might, have a greater appreciation of it. And I think, to be fair to people like Buchanan, that was part of their philosophy too. It's just that they saw that, well, you could appreciate the natural world, providing you kept the cars out of the way, and keeping the cars out of the way meant you had to build these dual carriageways at either end of the tunnel, for example. So you might say they had a similar end in mind. But, the Walk at Reclamation, many of you bought our front door from there. And it was, a pioneering initiative, making a business out of reuse, which in the 1970s was still seen as slightly quaint and, arcane, along with the bikes and that kind of thing. But now, something that we now take for granted, I think. And finally, of course, we're now in the business where you might say all these things have sort of caught up with us. We're now in the period where these concerns about light pollution and noise pollution and atmospheric pollution, are being tackled with a wide range of solutions. And I think, it's a very large subject, this. I really didn't want to come here and talk about something very broad. I wanted to talk about an element of it, an element of traffic and transport and that kind of thing, which can't seem to live without. But we now are at least in a position where we're more appreciative of it. I think the only thing about the share and pair shop I always find is that its opening hours are very restricted. So it would be nice if it was open a little bit more frequently, but I suspect that's a function of volunteers. But you'll be aware that it's again a pioneer in doing this new way of looking at how we might look at the natural environment. I was talking to someone about this, giving this talk, and I was talking about traffic, and they said, well, you know, what you really want to mention is open top buses, because I thought, because if there's one example of something which really shows how, on the one hand, we're accommodating tourists and we're accommodating those people who wish to appreciate the built environment, this improving architecture that people have been talking about, then we should be grateful that people are using open-top buses rather than motor cars. But he was saying how dreadful it was if you were stuck in a traffic jam behind one, which seems to be, you know, just the very thing about a city like this. On the one hand, we want the historic environment and people to enjoy it, but on the other, you know, we need to accommodate people who need to get about. So thank you for listening. I hope it's been of interest. The exhibition Costing the Earth is opening in June. We'll talk about all these things and a great deal of other things as well, water pollution and that kind of thing. But I hope you have found it interesting, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
We'll chat for the
Section, I mean,
well, we don't have any questions
Oh,
here
right.
at the moment, but
no,
some from the room, maybe.
yeah.
Just when you talk about the underground car park, which was initially potentially going to be part of that underground structure, what stopped that? What were the main drivers? You know, curtail that.
The reason why, I mean, the question was what put an end to the underground development, and in fact, the whole of the Buchanan proposals. I mean, they argued through the 1960s and the 1970s. The cost was a major concern, particularly after 1974. The other was really the building of the M4, because suddenly, you know, this massive scheme, you don't need it because the through traffic is going to bypass Bath altogether. You don't need to divert the through traffic through this scheme. And if the main part of the scheme was being abandoned, then this subsidiary bit about pedestrianising the centre and the underground development, it's principally a cost thing.
Just follow on to that. Did you kind of just had a thing for Bath, or is this something he intended elsewhere?
Oh no, he's engaged by people all over the country. I mean, one of the problems in Bath is the topography. I mean, he was approached by quite a number of places that are on the flat, like Oxford, for example, you know, where you can build a ring road. I mean, the reason why, you know, he came up with this elaborate kind of knitting pattern of a road scheme is simply that building a bypass was going to be inordinately expensive because the road ran along the valley bottom, and the only way that you could build a ring road or a bypass around the whole city of Bath was by building some enormous road that would be at a high level, you know. So it was the topography is the reason why these various schemes appear so elaborate, because you couldn't do the simple thing, which is build a bypass.
G. Dan Smith and Colombo pulled off this kind of scheme in Newcastle.
Yeah.
and did an acceptors kind of thing and wrecked the city centre.
Yeah, yeah.
And to this day, people regret what was done.
Yeah,
It took a long, long time for anything to get going again.
yeah. No, absolutely.
I'm fascinated by that Walcott wreck was the first wreck place in Europe.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Do you know when that actually started?
I think it opened in 1972.
And I don't know how that relates to the fact that the Preservation Trust had a warehouse for a long time. And
Yeah.
they went around every day, the piles of wreckage in the streets and skips and things like that, collecting period fittings and ran the warehouse. I don't know what the time is.
No, I suppose it. I mean, they were. I suppose because Walcott Reclamation were a business.
Yeah.
I mean, they were looking to reclaim these things and sell them on. It was less of the sort of preservation conservation in the way that our Preservation Trust might have approached these things, but I think it was fair. I mean, I think in the early, I mean, the arts workshop, which its name's a bit of a misnomer, in fact, because it sounds as though it's kind of, you know, community arts. I mean, it was much more than that, and I think perhaps, you know, this has been perhaps an illustration of that. I mean, it's a fairly hard to pin down organization to start with, and then it kind of forms into these different sections, and one of them was the reclamation, one of them was this transport unit, which was to do with the bikes, hiring bikes, selling the bikes, and then there was the alternative technology unit, but I think it's about 1972.
I have a question here. Or do you want to take one and then pass it?
Was there any attention paid to public transport? And for example, I'm thinking of the question of trams and things like that.
Well, I think it's a very good question as to whether attention was paid to public transport. I mean, I think the Buchanan proposals, I mean, the one thing they missed, for example, is park and ride. I mean, they seem to have had a kind of blind spot about that. I think in the early 1960s, the idea of public transport was that it was something which was going to kind of wither for local traffic. That you'd still have intercity rail and that kind of thing, but somehow public transport was going to wither because everyone's going to have a car. So it's not really. It wasn't really part of the core of the idea. It was all to do it, and I think there is that kind of mindset that they had, as Michael was saying. You know, it was all accommodating the motor car. You know, somehow you've got to allow for it and keep it out of the way. But I think that things like trams, which, you know, from the point of view of power and you know, a much more sensible. I mean, the historic street plan of Bath makes trams and having. I mean, I think if you could pedestrianise the centre, but the street plan is a bit kind of restricted.
Should we ask this
Should we
question?
have an electronic
Yeah, so we've got
one?
so one online. Can you comment on how air pollution has historically been understood and managed? Always as a public health problem, or also about buildings, plants, and its impact on animals as well? And perhaps also from an industrial and home heating sources, that basically it's saying that's producing air pollution as well, not just traffic. So how does that all fit in?
Okay. This is what I wanted to keep avoiding. I mean, I think that one of the things about Bath is that it goes from being a place where atmospheric pollution came principally from domestic fires, and the topography of Bath is such that, at least in the centre, the prevailing winds were unable to completely clear the smog, really. I mean, Bath is prone to temperature inversions. That is, you know, fog and smoke producing, you know, smog. So, you know, as soon as in the 18th century, they start burning coal in wintertime in quantity. Atmospheric pollution is a problem. In the 19th century, there is industry in Bath, there's manufacturing industries, fairly modest. It's not industrial smoke in the way that you get them in the great conurbations. Now we're in the position where, you know, we've got smokeless fuels from the mid-1950s, a lot of that carbon-based transport, you know, I mean, steam locomotives, for example, you know, trains, the production of poisonous chemicals and things like gas production. Bath Gas, Light and Coke Company is public enemy #1 if you're talking about pollution. In the early 20th century, water pollution, atmospheric pollution, I mean, you name it, with the disappearance of that, it's car pollution. And all of those forms of atmospheric pollution are constrained by the topography of the deep valley sides, which prevent it escaping as easily as it might if we were in a more exposed position. You know, the prevailing winds have less chance to clear that smog, which is why in the centre of Bath, or if you're in London on the London Road, you know, in the summer, you know, you can taste the pollution. So I think there is that. What was the other bit of the question?
It was more on the slightly broader, really, on as a public health problem. Were people concerned about the impact on plants, for example, or was it just seen as a human one? You mentioned buildings, the questions about animals, and
I mean, I think
yeah.
until the early 1950s, when there are a series of disastrous poisonous smog events that are nationwide, particularly in London, which result in the Clean Air Acts of the mid-1950s. Until then, you know, I think atmospheric pollution was considered in urban areas to be like an occupational hazard, really. I was reading an article about the Bath Gasworks, and someone was saying how they didn't mind the smell because they just accepted that as a hazard of being able to have gas lighting and gas for cooking in their homes. So I think most people, after the Second World War, took that kind of thing as an occupational hazard of living in a city. I think when you start to get a lot more car pollution and these kind of weather events that make it poisonous and not moving, that's when people start to pay attention to it. I think the idea of the environment being impacted is really something that doesn't happen until the 1960s. I mean, this book I mentioned by Rachel Carson came as a kind of bolt from the blue. People had never really thought about it in the abstract before. The idea of, you know, pesticides and DDT and that kind of thing having a general impact. So that is relatively recent, you know, 50, 60, 70 years ago.
One from the room, and then there's another bit.
Yeah, I think that. I was interested by this idea of sacrificing one area for ostensibly the good of another. I was wondering, throughout this, you know, from the 18th century onward, either in transport or other things, whether these sort of ground plans for Bath, whether you think they were sort of myopic in there, so focused on what's good for Bath that the areas around it suffer as a result. I mean, the idea, this isn't necessarily my opinion, but one thing that springs to mind, say, being from Bradford and Avon, obviously the construction of bypasses and so on, the traffic that goes through there. So yes, the problem may have been solved for Bath, more people in it, but towns elsewhere suffer as a result. I mean, is there that theme of myopia in how these Bath plans are constructed, or are they more considered than that?
I think if you're looking at the post-war traffic plans, I think they were myopic to an extent, in as much as I think, I don't want to sound damning here, but I think if the high status Georgian buildings have been preserved. But, you know, I think the business of the tunnel was in part, it would go under, you know, the great Lansdowne construction project, the Queen Squares, you know, the circus. Colin Buchanan talked about the plan for Bath as, and I quote, a delicate piece of urban surgery. The idea that you were having to pick between these beautifully designed buildings, but that along the way, it was going to result in the sacrifice of a whole swathes of artisan buildings of the same period. You know, what if you walk down Walcott Street, I mean, that a lot of that is 18th century development that has been adapted in the 19th centuries. And a lot of artisan dwellings were to have been sacrificed for that. So, you know, what we now consider to be architecturally significant were at the time considered to be something which, well, they're very nice or quite nice, but in a lot of cases have been allowed to deteriorate and were worth sacrificing for the motor car.
I've got one here. Actually, I'll run two questions together. What a fascinating talk. Thank you, Stuart. The Buchanan plan reminded me of urban planning initiatives in large German cities at the time, where, however, typically tram lines were put underground in the city centres, which wasn't done in Bath. And linked to that, because you raised some questions on the Buchanan plan, how did the Buchanan plan accommodate car parking?
Well, the car parking was to be below ground. So that was going to be part of this subsurface network of tunnels. And I mean, it sounds like the catacombs, you know, but how the, you know, the vaults beneath some of the streets in Bath were to be sort of utilized into this kind of subterranean network, which would have extended, you know, down, it would have extended down to Southgate Street, you know, some way, Stall Street, out under Milsom Street and things like that. So I think car parking was going to be, as the car park in under Waitrose in Walcott Street, you know, is now. And in fact, the underground car park, ironically, the underground car park in Southgate Street, the part of the new, much more recent development is underground. So I think that would have been where they not only keep the cars out of the separate from people, they'd store them separately too. I think there was in the 1960s, again, as Michael was saying in Newcastle, you know, there was a great appetite for this kind of, if that's the word, certainly a great interest in it as being the solution to the traffic problem. That you accommodate the motor car, you don't restrict it, and across it, you know, right across, as you say, you know, Germany and Europe, you know, these things are going on all over in a kind of. And now I mean, it seems almost strange kind of period, really, looking back on it, that people were. I mean, you can see how it is. Traffic planners went from being kind of saviors to be demons, you know, within the course of about 10 or 15 years, you know, what the megalomaniacs, you know, plans. But I suppose it was an answer to. Yeah.
I was struck by how the timing of Buchanan was so sort of parallel with the flood alleviation scheme.
Yes, yeah.
And well, two thoughts occurred to me. First of all, to what extent those had been thought about and planned together to work together, because there's been a lot of sort of disastrous, you know, failure to consider flooding in various schemes. But then also the fact that we're so fortunate to have the river corridor, which is such a key part of our sort of ecological networks that we have now, the Dark River corridor, and actually from the map that you put up, we wouldn't have that if we had Buchanan.
No.
So, yeah, to what extent were they being considered together? Because the timing was really quite similar.
I think it's almost coincidental. I think that there've been plans put aside to do something about the river and its flooding for a long time, for 100 years or so, even longer ago than that, to prevent the flooding of the centre of the city, because it was having every kind of commercial impact, let alone inconvenience, and also on the subject of water pollution, which I haven't really talked about, the fact that until 1914 the rivers with all the foul sewers you end up. So whenever there's a flood, well, I don't want to upset anybody who's not yet eaten this evening, but I mean, if you're, it's not just the water that's is visited on the areas, on the floodplain. So, I mean, I think it'd been under consideration for quite a while. There was a disastrous, not a disastrous flood, but I mean, there was a serious flood in 1968, in the middle of summer, actually, of the River Avon, which coincided. In fact, there were plans already for the straightening of the river and the removal of weirs at Twerton, for example, where there had been wool mills and that kind of thing. So I don't think they weren't considered together. I think they were separate. These were separate projects. But at the time when those kind of things were, I think there was more in the way of public funds for these kind of major projects at that time, which all comes to a kind of grinding halt with the oil crisis in 1974. But I don't think they were considered together.
Couple of things, Stuart. I mean, the business of parking transport underground wasn't really new.
No.
This apartment plan to have an enormous stairway underneath the floor of the place, but there wasn't a room. But the other thing that's struck me about the 60s is that there seemed to be a sort of lack of sensitivity and an arrogance that they invest, lack of sensitivity to the value of the smaller houses. And the only solution was to sweep them away and have something that they thought was better. Wasn't new here, just here, it was all over the place. And the social effect was disastrous in destroying the communities. And now we know about not having a starter codes and all the rest. If you look at the pictures of that before the clearances, there were starter codes all over the houses there. And they were cleared away. I always thought one of the most striking pictures in the collection of the Preservation Trust is at Morford Street, where the bottom half has a JCB in the bond town. When the stop on the clearances happened, halfway up Morford Street, the top half of Morford Street was then modernised and brought back into use with perpetual right of space. The bottom half was lost. And I think because there's lack of sensitivity, lack of understanding about what was there. It's a terrible shame.
I think it's very true. I think there was that lack of sensitivity about, or at least an appreciation of the artisan dwellings, the kind of, as you say, the Morford Street, the Lampard buildings, and
Holloway.
Yeah, Holloway. Well, yeah, which was a real a real sacrifice.
What would those houses in Holloway be worth now? The attendance at the station.
Well, no, precisely that. No, precisely that. I mean, I think that one of the ironies about Walcott Street, which I think is a sort of good news story with regards to this, is because the plans for the Buchanan proposals would have involved, flattening Walcott Street from about 1965 onwards. As a consequence of that, hardly any of the landlords of properties there did any improvements or demolition or adaptations or putting UPVC windows in, or the 1960s equivalents. And as a consequence, when the Buchanan proposals are abandoned, Walcott Street's left as an almost intact historic environment. So one of the things that people now appreciate about Walcott Street is the consequence of the planning blight which comes in the wake of the Buchanan proposal. So you couldn't have more of an irony than that. So whereas in Holloway, as Michael was saying, you know, the whole community is virtually marmalised. In Walcott Street, not only did you get that, but that's where the Arts Workshop has its headquarters, because people are squatting in these properties. So another irony is, you know, the organisation which gives Bath its fame as a pioneer in environmental appreciation and all of those things I've been talking about, has its HQ in squatting properties made available because of the Buchanan proposal and the planning blight that came in its wake. No, it's the irony around us.
I've got another one. I mean, we're talking about the sack of Bath now in the 1970, and I think that's probably when, from what you're saying, when Walcott Reclamation was set up, because of everything being ripped out of these old buildings. And the classic example, and Michael said it, grade 1 listed buildings were safe, grade 2 weren't. And the classic quote from the sack of Bath was one of the councillors saying, if you want people to live in these type of Georgian artisan dwellings, you'd better find a Georgian artisan to live there, because nobody else will.
No.
And that was the state of them. So anyway, thanks so much, Stuart, for a fascinating talk. Looking forward to the exhibition. Were you able to carry out oral history with those involved with the Arts Workshop on this topic? Yes,
is the answer to that question. Yes, we have been involved in a lot of oral history, particularly with the element of the Arts Workshop called the Comtech unit. I mean, another irony for you. The building that houses the Museum of Bath at Work, which is had been built as a tennis court in 1777. Before the museum moved in, the Arts Workshop put a proposal to use that as an alternative technology headquarters. So the Comtech unit and all of these people involved in geodesic domes and all the rest of it, they were going to move into the building where I work. So when we did these interviews with people from the Arts Workshop, I did feel slightly guilty about it, because, you know, I was asking them about, you know, what they'd been up to. And I thought, you know, they would have been in here. It wouldn't have been me doing the interviews. It would be them and their wind turbines and things. So, you know, that and as Michael was saying, you know, Morford Street is, you can almost see the point in Morford Street where there was almost like a change in the weather, you know, where they kind of stopped. They stopped this kind of, you know, knocking everything down and putting up flats, and a change where they saw the possibilities of adaptive reuse of these kind of artisan dwellings. And the Morford Street tennis court, which is the home to the museum, I mean, it just managed to escape right on the very edge of this kind of creeping, you know, juggernaut of development. And as I say, was going to be part of the Arts Workshop's portfolio of property. But we got there, well, we didn't get there first, actually. The museum put in a workable solution.
Right. Are there any more questions, or are we done? Because I think well, everyone found that very interesting, Stuart. It covered a wide range of subjects there. So I think just got time to say thank you, Stuart, for a very interesting talk, and come again sometime.